Welcome to what will be one of a couple position previews here as KCOU looks to get you started and get you prepared for Mizzou football as they get set for kickoff in August for what is shaping up to be one of the most anticipated seasons in Mizzou history. I will be joined today, as I will for the rest of the time, by my friend Ian Paprocki. And how are you?
I'm doing good, Billy. Great to be talking Mizzou football again. It's been a long off season. I hate the football off season because it feels like it takes forever. But like you said, one of the most exciting seasons in history coming up this fall, and I'm excited to preview it a little bit here.
Right, and feels like there's a little bit more juice going into this season just because of what happened last year and the way that now the whole system is different with the breaking up of the divisions, 12-team playoff. It just feels like a new era, and maybe now's the time for, schools like Missouri, schools that have been on the tier trying to crack their way into the top. Chaos can be a little bit of an opportunity, and seems like they've found that, and that's very well what this year could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the schedule is also very enticing when you look at, Mizzou's opponents and you compare it to some of the other schedules in the SEC. Obviously, two new teams being added in Oklahoma and Texas. And like you said, the division's kind of being reshaped there and the schedule's looking a little bit different. So, I think Mizzou definitely, a couple of tough opponents on there. Definitely, no super easy SEC game by any means. But I think Eli Drinkwitz got to be feeling pretty good about that roll of the dice.
Yeah, as we sit here just 2 months away from that opening kickoff against Murray State, it feels like the conversation from where it was last year about the quarterback room. I mean, how much has that shifted from, all the uncertainty going into that position group last year when, you had, what really was a competition between Brady Cook and Sam Horn, even through that first week of the season, to where this year it's, one and there's a big gap between two, obviously, with the Tommy John surgery that Horn had to undergo. What kind of confidence do you think that gives a football team just to have an established signal caller that they can look to as a captain and a leader?
I think there's a lot of confidence. I mean, at this time last year, we didn't know who was going to be the starting quarterback.
Right.
I mean, I think throughout the offseason, Brady Cook was probably the favorite, but nobody really knew. I mean, it was going to be a competition between him and Sam Horn. So the fact that this team has their quarterback set already this early in the offseason and, just kind of having confidence, like you said, it's a great thing for this team when they can look at last season's success and the quarterback being the leader of the team and Brady Cook being able to come through in a lot of big moments for this team. They've got to feel great about having him back for another year. And, I mean, you think he's got to be even more confident than he was last year as well. I think it's a two-way thing. The team's more confident, and I think Brady Cook obviously more confident as well. And we'll see what happens. Obviously, seems like a recipe for success.
No, and there's no reason not to be based on that performance, that he was able to put together last year. Sure, a couple games he'd probably want back, but just to have that belief in the locker room, I think is huge for a team, especially a team that's going to have a lot of questions to answer defensively. To have that coming back on offense is I think huge for them early on, and we'll certainly see how that manifests itself early in the season. You know, we'll get into Brady a little bit later, but I'm just curious when you think about the depth in that room, how much does a lack of Sam Horn scare you? Do you think Drew Pine is a solid enough backup, or do you think there's some real questions about what this team can do if Brady, for whatever reason, is stricken with the injury bug?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be questions. I think, there would have been questions last year if Sam Horn came in because obviously it's a guy that has not had experience yet. He's a younger guy, has not been a starting quarterback yet. I think that's a more of an exciting thing for me looking towards this season with Drew Pine, a guy who does have starting experience in college football. But obviously Sam Horn is a great quarterback and has been a great prospect. And I think this quarterback room will miss him a lot. And it's also a thing where, like, even if Sam Horn wasn't hurt, like, it would be a really good learning opportunity for him to sit another year under Brady Cook and learn from a guy, in my opinion, like Brady, who has really started to grasp playing in the SEC. But it's not something that scares me a whole lot. I think you're always going to be scared if your starting quarterback goes down.
Yeah.
I think that's part of football. And, unless you have some amazing backup, which, I don't know if there's any examples even out there of a team that would feel really good if their starting quarterback got hurt. So I think it's just something that, you never want it to happen, but I wouldn't say I feel any better or worse about it than I did last year.
Yeah, I mean, you raised some interesting points, and obviously now with with the way the portal's been opened, it's even harder to keep those guys in your locker room just because, there's always the chance that they can jump ship, go make money somewhere else. It's not like it was before where you could kind of hide these guys behind, people are going to find them, people are going to offer them, and they're going to go take their chances to go start elsewhere. So I really think it is pretty hard to build that depth. And listen, Pine wasn't spectacular in his season as a starter at Notre Dame. Obviously, struggled with injuries with Arizona State last year. But, I think if you're a Tiger fan, I don't think you're incredibly worried about that because as far as backup quarterbacks go, your chances are either a talented but unproven freshman or a guy who's just been sitting in the pipeline for a while who really just doesn't have a lot of chances to go play elsewhere. So, I think that get they got after spring practice, once they knew that Horn was going to be unable to go, I think is about as good as you can ask for. But we'll see how things play out, and obviously it's all going to come down to what Brady can do. And I'm curious, Ian, when you think about his performance last year, what kind of grade would you give him, and where would you say that leaves Mizzou headed into this year?
Yeah, I'd probably be around the B plus A minus range for Brady Cook. I think his best football was in those first 6 games of the season.
Yeah.
I think if you asked me for my grade halfway through last year, I'd be at an A. And then the second half of the year, Mizzou was still winning games, so I don't think anybody was really too critical. But there were a couple of games. I mean, we can look at the Cotton Bowl, for example, the first half of the Cotton Bowl, where the quarterback play maybe a little bit shaky, and so I think going into this year, it is a little bit of a cause for concern for me in terms of the grade, just because of the way that I think he started the season so strong and he didn't finish it quite as strong. And so I think another big thing about it is just like looking at the beginning of last season, it was a quarterback competition. He was fired up. He didn't know if he was going to start. He was fighting for his job. As the season went on, it became clear that he was number one quarterback and that he wasn't going to lose his job anymore. And it's almost like that's when the play, and I'm not saying, Brady Cook was bad in the second half of the season. I'm not saying that at all. But, I don't think he was quite as good as he was at the beginning when he was really fighting for his job. And going into this season, where obviously he's not fighting for his job at all, he's the number one quarterback from day one. It is a little bit of a cause for concern, not a huge concern, but something that I've definitely been thinking about a little bit.
And I think that's a fair assessment. So I think the question becomes how much can you use this offense that doesn't involve Brady Cook's legs? Because I mean, you think about the Georgia game and the Tennessee game are really the ones the back half of the year that stick out in my mind. Even the Cotton Bowl as well, where you're talking about big time games where Missouri kind of struggled to throw the ball down the football field. And it felt like, the main way they were moving the ball, if it wasn't Cody Schrader doing Cody Schrader things, was Brady Cook using his legs. You think about all those times in the Tennessee games that he was able to pick up third downs, some really key moments in that game. I think he had at least 3 or 4 scrambles for first downs. You'll look at the Georgia game where he was the leading rusher in the first half, same kind of deal. He finished that game with, I think, just a tad over 200 passing yards and 2 picks with an under 500 or under 50% completion percentage. So I think the onus on Kirby Moore this offseason is to find a way to develop this passing game. And instead of what it was last year, which was the quick hitters and then the play action deep, there's got to be a way to make sure that Mizzou can consistently throw the football over the middle of the field and have confidence in Brady's ability not to give the ball away and find a way to have a more complex downfield passing game because you've got guys that can take the top off the defense. And we saw that in moments, but it felt like too often last year. Those 3 games I listed were the 3 best defenses that Mizzou saw last year. And it was just too often they struggled to take the top off until it was too late. They had the early touchdown against Georgia. And then, of course, the Marquise Johnson catch the very end of the third quarter against that Ohio State team. But, there was a real, I think, from defenses, lack of fear of Brady throwing the ball over the middle and down the field. And I think that's the biggest thing this offense is, to see how that passing game can develop. And this will be something maybe we get into when we talk about the wide receivers, but that feels like a big thing for him is to see how much he can evolve in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the point you bring up about, his games like that being against those really good defenses. Ohio State, great defense in the Cotton Bowl. Obviously, Georgia has been well known to have one of the best defenses in college football for some time now. And I think it kind of raises the question of just like how far can this team go? Because you're going to have games in that SEC schedule that I mentioned that was a little bit easier. Vanderbilt on the schedule. You've got Mississippi State on the schedule, South Carolina on the schedule. I'm not saying any of those teams are going to be terrible, but some of the weaker teams in the SEC, it's a question of like, okay, this team has playoff expectations now. They finished last year as a top 10 team in the country. With the expectations being that high, you're going to run into those defenses again at some point. And I think that, Brady Cook is well positioned with who he has coming back. His receivers, obviously, Luther Burden, Theo Weiss, Marquise Johnson, all those guys are back. Brett Norfleet, who became, I think, one of his favorite targets towards the end of the year. I think he's a big breakout candidate that we'll get into. I think, later on we talk about that position group. But overall, I think one of the biggest questions for me is the running game. And Brady Cook, obviously very good with his legs, but losing Cody Schrader in that offense, it's going to be interesting to see how they
Yeah.
can come back from that, because Cody Schrader in those games that you mentioned where Brady Cook maybe wasn't getting it done with his arm and the passes downfield weren't working. Those were a lot of games where Cody Schrader would take over, with his legs and he would make plays. Now you don't have that same playmaker anymore on your offense because he left. So I think it becomes a question of, can Marcus Carroll and Nate Noel step in and have similar production for you? What will the offensive line look like? So I think there are a lot of interesting things to look at throughout the offense that I think will kind of dictate the way we look at Brady Cook as the season goes on and will kind of help out his performance.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. This offense certainly fewer question marks, but they're important question marks to see. And you kind of wonder with this changing format, is the performance that Brady put out there with his total body of work good enough to get Mizzou into the playoff? I think so. At home he was great, but I mean, you think about some of those road starts. Kentucky was a real rough start. Turned the ball over in that game. Finished the game with under 200 passing yards. Like that was something that Mizzou did because their defense came up with stops. You look at the Georgia game, he had that touchdown pass early, but after that, really kind of struggled in that game. The only time Mizzou really was able to move the ball in the second half was when they started picking up yards in the ground game. So I have some questions about him on the road, and you think about the other two road starts, or Vanderbilt, which I think was 50% Mizzou fans at that game, and obviously Arkansas. You saw what that stadium looked like at the end of the season. Like there was, when you compare those road environments to what they're going to see at Alabama and Texas A&M, and depending on how the seasons go for South Carolina and Mississippi State, respectively, I think there's this situation where you're looking at both of those games that you could be walking into a very, very hostile environment. There's a chance, obviously, that the wheels fall off the bus for South Carolina and Beamer's gone by November. But I mean, you think about a first-year coach coming in and Jeff Lebby. I think that's a team that's going to improve throughout the year, and you might be getting to that game in November, and they're saying to themselves, "Man, we're at 4 or 5 wins, but this is a chance to help us to bowl eligibility and notch a big time signature win to kickstart the era." So, I still have my questions about Brady on the road. Do you think that's a fair concern, or do you think I'm maybe, just digging a little too hard in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a fair concern when you look at the results, like you brought up. I mean, Kentucky being that true road game, Georgia being that true road game. Those are a couple of the games where he struggled, and obviously not as much. At Vanderbilt, I was at that game. Were you at that game as well?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
You're right. It was 50% Mizzou fans. It was not a hostile atmosphere at all. So I think that is a very valid concern. But when I look at this team in some of those games, they found ways to win. Kentucky, the defense was fantastic after that first quarter. You know, Obviously, the offensive line. I mentioned Cody Schrader coming through in these games as well. So you kind of look at some of these other aspects of this team and people around Brady Cook, and it kind of starts to feel like maybe there's a little bit of a worry about relying on other parts of the team and not the quarterback. And so, it'll be interesting to see. I think that is a valid question. I think it is interesting that you bring up some of those late season road environments that they will see. Um, but yeah, I think it'll definitely be more so hostile this year, I think, than it was last year. I think Mizzou caught a couple of breaks in some of their road environments. Arkansas late in the season. I mean, they were so far out of it that
Right.
that should have been a more hostile environment than it was. So it's a valid point to bring up, though.
Yeah, and that's going to be the thing I'm interested to see. I mean, you look at the numbers, like if you're just looking at a purely statistical standpoint, like a season where you throw for 21 touchdowns, run for another 8, and only turn the ball over 6 times, like, obviously that's something that you want from your quarterback. But you look at those 6 turnovers, 4 of them were in, games you lost. And I get maybe that second one, in both the Georgia and the LSU games, like, you have to force the ball a little bit. But, that's, I think the biggest question for him is what level can he elevate to? And, how much do you need him to elevate to? Because, I think this team can win games with him being a decent quarterback. But when you think about what they bring back on the offensive line and the fact that, I think maybe outside of Ole Miss and maybe Georgia, this is the most talented receiver room in the SEC. And they have the most talented receiver in the SEC, on the field. Like there's a chance that if Brady can elevate his level, that, this is a top 5, maybe best passing game in the country. And that's, I think, what should have what should what Mizzou fans should really keep their eye on is to say, is there a chance that he can elevate his play to be able to dictate an offense that can get up there in that sphere? Do you think that's unrealistic?
No, yeah, I think you absolutely hit it on the nail. I think that, um, look, Mizzou is not a team that is going to rely solely on Brady Cook to win games because of how talented they are, how good the defense is, and all of those returners on that line and at receiver. But I totally agree with you that if Brady Cook elevates his game and becomes more of a deep ball threat as a passer, I think that it takes this team to the next level. I really do. I think, if Brady has an off game, we saw it last year, the team really was still able to operate.
Right.
Um, so I think it's a good point that you bring up for sure. But I do agree that if he's able to elevate his game, I think this team goes to a completely another level. If it's kind of the same as last year, maybe we see similar results. My worry is just about the no competition and maybe he's is going to get a little bit complacent and settle into this spot, whereas we're not going to see that same fire that we saw at the beginning of last year with the Sam Horn competition. So I think that's my biggest worry. um but yeah, it's definitely a thing where Mizzou would really like him to take a step forward, especially in the passing game and early in games too.
Yeah, and I think not only early in games, but early in the season. Last year I think there was a little bit of a cautious approach, because it was Kirby's first time calling plays. Like there's a feeling out process. But when you think about how conservative the play calling was in those first 2 games against South Dakota and MTSU, it was a little bit felt like Brady was struggling with confidence. And then obviously they hit that play against K-State, and then they really had to open up in that game because they couldn't run the ball. So I'd love to see this Mizzou offense in attack mode because, you have 4 games against defenses that you should be able to score against. And, I'd love to see as much as they'll allow it because you will play those teams and they may drop 8 into coverage. But I'd love to see opportunities for Brady to try and attack down the field. Opportunities where he's throwing jump balls to his receivers and giving them chances to make plays. Opportunities where they have a chance to really work on chemistry to make sure that, when they get into later in the season, it's not hoping for big plays. It's, the connections there that they'll go out and make the big plays because it felt like, this year it was a little bit sporadic. It felt like your only chances of really hitting the deep ball was just hoping Marquise Johnson would come open on some play action. I'd love to see a little bit more variation in that respect. Whether it's finding ways to get Luther open down the field or Theo more chances at contested catches. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you. I think that Brady needs to play fearless. I think there were a lot of times last year where he held on to the ball for a little bit longer than he should. Maybe he tried to run the ball when he could have, still gone downfield. I think he needs to understand that he has one of the best wide receiver rooms in the country. You've got Luther Burden coming back. You got Theo Breeze coming back, Marquise Johnson, Mookie Cooper. I mean, all of his weapons here. You just need to trust it. I think he needs to throw the ball more and be more confident because that's when he was at his best last year. You got to trust a guy like Luther Burden to win a 50-50 ball. He's a
Right.
top 10 prospect in the 2025 draft for a reason because he's arguably the best wide receiver in the country. So I think that has to be the point of emphasis when it comes to Brady Cook. Like, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to throw picks. It's going to happen. But I feel like, obviously he's historically has not been a guy who has thrown a lot of interceptions and had a lot of turnovers. I think he just needs to kind of you let that out of his game, if that makes sense, and just focus on being more aggressive because I think that's what will take him to the next level. It will take the offense to the next level because last year, obviously his legs are good. Obviously he has speed, but I think he relies on it a little bit too much sometimes. And I think that if he does that again this year, you're not going to get the most out of this special wide receiver room
Right.
that you have.
And the fact that you have your, four leading receivers all returning, and you have some really talented players in the pipeline, and now that you have a tight end who's a weapon, and that's something that I don't think Mizzou factored into the playbook last summer. I don't think that's something that anyone on that staff counted on. I think they hoped, but I think honest to God, I think the choice going into the season was listen, Tyler Stevens is going to be the guy, and he's going to be a great blocker. But if we need a big play, it's going to be four wideouts. I think they learned over the course of the season that Brett Norfleet can be a real stud. And I think that's something that's going to factor into the way that they install plays in this offseason. And I'm excited to see what that looks like coming out. But I think this kind of thought that's been in my mind is that I think the difference between Mizzou being a playoff team and not a playoff team is what this defense looks like. I think the difference between Mizzou sneaking into the playoff and being a legitimate national title contender, I think, is Brady Cook in this passing game.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think there are obviously questions with the defense, but I think a quarterback can take you further than anybody else on the team. And
Right.
so I totally agree with that. And I think that it is going to help having a summer where you know more of what you have. Like you said
Yeah.
with Norfolk, you've got a tight end who has potential to be one of the best in the SEC and in the country with what he showed throughout his true freshman season. I like that the point that you bring up, like they're going to draw plays more geared towards him, I think, this summer. And they're going to know who their guys are. Marquise Johnson broke out in a big way last year. And I think, Brady Cook is going to have more of an opportunity to get comfortable with guys like Marquise Johnson and Brett Norfleet. And yeah, I'm totally with you on that.
One of the things that I think is just going to be the most fascinating to watch is, just to see how much did what happened at the end of the year, galvanize him as a quarterback. When you think about, obviously the K-State, he was able to put together a drive, but that, definitely felt more about Mevis than it did about him. But, you think about the work he did in that Tennessee game, and obviously Cody got the credit for that game. But I mean, if you go back and watch, there's several times Mizzou's backed up against the goal line and it's third and long, and Brady just found a way to break through and find a way to get to that first down. And I know he didn't light it up on the stat sheet, but he had some big carries in that game where Tennessee had a real shot to anchor themselves in the ball game. But Brady found a way to pick up first downs. You'll get the Florida game where he put together. You and I called that game. I mean, that drive he put together at the end was fantastic. It wasn't pretty, but he found a way on 4th and 17 to launch that ball in there. And Arkansas again didn't light it up. It didn't need to. And then you go to the Cotton Bowl. Listen, should he have had a chance to finish that game? Maybe not because of the way he played through 2.5 quarters, but he found a way down the stretch. Made some big throws in that fourth quarter, and especially on that long throw to Marquise at the end of the third quarter. So you know I wonder what the mentality is. There's a new expectation at Mizzou. I hope that carries with it. Not necessarily pressure, but motivation for him to see what's possible and see how close they can be to those top teams, because I think that was the difference between, Mizzou and Georgia. When you think about it, was I think that, Carson Beck was much more confident as a passer, and their passing game was a little bit more developed. I think that's truly what cost Mizzou in that game.
Yeah, and I think another thing is just you can't be complacent about what took place at the end of the year. I look at that Cotton Bowl game. I'm not saying the Cotton Bowl is going to be a copy of every single game you've got on the schedule in 2024, but against that Ohio State defense, he struggled for three
Right.
quarters, just about three quarters. There are a lot of guys in this defense that left. I think it's not crazy to say that a similar situation this year, if he can't wake it up in the first half, this team may be down by a lot more. That Ohio State game, Darius Robinson was fantastic on the line. He's in the NFL now. Guys, like Chris Abrams-Drain contributed in that game a lot. It's just like they lost a lot. I feel I'm just kind of worried about that happening again next season and just not being able to play a full four quarters. I think there are a lot of times, obviously, even when Brady Cook was playing really well in the beginning of the year, I feel like this Mizzou offense, the biggest thing they lacked last year was the inability to play a complete full four quarters of a game.
Hmm.
And that's what I want to see them do next year.
And that's where you hope, the way the schedule starts for you, that you have that opportunity. When you look at those first four games, you don't have to leave Columbia, and you get Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, who, got a new coach, and um, Bill O'Brien, who's obviously had a successful track record, but that should be a game that you win comfortably at home. And a Vanderbilt team that, yes, has made some changes, but really lost more than I think they got. And sure, Diego Pavia is, I think, going to be a solid player, but that's a game you should be fine in. And, with the way that secondary played last year, you should be able to light up the scoreboard against them. So I think that's the biggest key for him in these first four games, is to really feel good about, not just, can I make the throws and not turn the ball over, but that I can attack and be successful, and we can take what we want. And to have that mindset going into that road game at College Station, I think is going to be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it lines up well for Mizzou at the beginning of this season, and kind of going back to that conversation about last year and just how the offense really didn't attack in those first two games. I would like to see that more. Now, my theory to that is I think that maybe seeing a couple of really soft opponents on the schedule, maybe they didn't want to break out the entire playbook.
Right.
And it worked out for them in that K-State game when they did kind of start opening up that playbook and lighting up the Wildcats. It worked to an extent, but I don't know that the approach is something that you necessarily want to replicate, because there are a couple games there early in the season where yes, you should beat all of these teams, but you're a lot more comfortable with your offense now. Obviously, Kirby Moore, a lot more comfortable as a play caller. I think you have to let it loose a little bit more. I'm not saying completely open up the playbook in those first couple of games, but it was a little bit, I mean, that Middle Tennessee game in week 2, a little bit close for comfort there. So I would like to see them be more aggressive.
Any parting thoughts before we head out, Ian?
It's exciting. I think that, I'm excited for Brady Cook. I'm happy that he is playing the way that he is. Towards the end of last year, he really woke up and he shut up this fan base, to be honest with you. A lot of people did not believe in him, and it was really impressive to see him kind of say, I am the quarterback. I am the this SEC quarterback for my dream school, and I'm here to stay. That was really impressive, but that can't be the end. There's still another level for Brady Cook, and he can't be satisfied. And that's been the whole, mantra for this Mizzou team. You can't be satisfied, no matter how much success you have. So I think that last year needs to be just the beginning, even with how impressive it was. He has a whole new level to reach, and I'm excited to see him do it this fall.
I think you're right. I think you hit the nail on the head. He was good enough to not hold the team back. I think it's about taking that next step this year, and I think he's capable of it because we've seen it in flashes. But can he elevate this team to where they feel good going into big games? Because it's not all on him, but I don't know if his performances were enough to win big time games last year. Because face it, if you're in the playoff, what you're contending is you're going to have to go beat good teams in neutral sites. That's what it's about. And we'll see if he can do that next year. I think that's the biggest key in this offseason. And, I think certainly have some questions about who replaces Cody Schrader. But, my biggest question in this offseason is what does Brady look like next August?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there's, the potential for him to take that next step, and I think there's the potential, and I don't want to say it, but there's the potential that we see that same Brady Cook that we saw last year. And listen, that's a good quarterback, but same Brady Cook from last year is not going to take the team where it needs to be. So there does need to be a step up, and I'm excited to see his mindset. It's tough to know what we're going to get because, like I said earlier on, this is a quarterback who has the job now. He didn't have the job at the beginning of last season. I think that's the biggest storyline early in the year for Mizzou is how does Brady Cook react to this different setup going into 2024?
Yeah. And I guess one last question I'll stick you with. Do you think the commitment of Zollers, do you think that's going to empty out the quarterback room after this year?
It's tough to say. I mean, I've been thinking Sam Horn was going to transfer. I thought he was going to transfer this past off season. He didn't. So, we'll see. It's a guy in Zollers who has a ton of potential, and it's a really exciting commitment for Eli Drinkwitz. But it's still an open job in 2025. I don't think you can ever expect a freshman quarterback to just win the job right away his freshman year, even if it is a guy like Zollers, who is one of the highest quarterback recruits Mizzou's ever gotten. So I don't know if I'd say it really empties out the room. I don't think everybody's going to stay. I would say, whether that's Pine, whether that's Sam Horn, whether that's Glover, I would expect one of them to hit the portal after this year, but it's kind of early to tell. You kind of have to see how things play out this year, but it's not Zoller's, job just being handed to him in 2025. It's still a very open position with Brady Cook leaving after this season. So, I wouldn't think that anybody's going to be too quick, at least the way things look right now to leave.
I'll say I don't think there's any shot he starts in 25, but I think 26. The question is Glover, Locke if he doesn't get the job. We'll see what Horn does, but I think Horn has the opportunity, which I think is, kind of perfect to maybe to be the bridge quarterback for a year, maybe two, and then go back into the draft. I think that's how it works out, but I don't know. Just interested to see how all those dice.
Maybe maybe like a one year deal, kind of like with Sam Hartman in Notre Dame, or Devin Leary at Kentucky. Not that that worked out as great as it should have, but maybe that's something that Mizzou looks at for 2025, saying, hey, let's get someone with experience who's got 1 year left. We don't have to have somebody tied up into this position too long so the Zalers can settle in, but let's have somebody to come in and step in for 1 year with a roster that it's still going to be talented, even though you are losing a lot after this season.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me, Ian. We'll see you guys back here for our next preview. We'll let you know what that is. Keep up with us on the KCOU Twitter page run by our friend here, Ian. Do you run the Twitter or do you just run the other social media?
Yeah, I help out running the Twitter. There are some other people that post on it as well, but yeah.
They don't let me in the decision-making room, so I'm not exactly sure what precisely is the chain of command. But thanks for joining me, brother. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, of course. Of course, been a lot of fun.